one thing that dominated the discourse, especially on the liberal left during the last Conservative government, was the idea that Tufton Street had their fingers in all of the pies of the Conservative government. So Tufton Street is an address in London where a lot of right-wing think tanks are registered, like the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Centre for Policy Studies, things like their pressure groups such as the Taxpayers Alliance and Save Our Statues, and the LGB Alliance was also registered there for a time. Now, there are other think tanks that aren't registered there either, but broadly this is synonymous with the kind of right-wing think tank grift sphere that specifically exists to try and shape public opinion through publishing studies that help reify a certain right-wing narrative of an issue. They've been constantly criticised as being completely opaque in terms of how they're funded, because it's mostly funded by billionaires, by millionaires, by the tobacco industry, by the arms industry, by the oil and gas industry, to try and foment their political interests by producing studies which are essentially just propaganda that essentially tries to find evidence for the conclusion that they want, rather than creating conclusions from evidence that they have delivered and created in earnest, sincerely. So they're essentially a propaganda unit for the super rich and for all of the kind of worst people from the excesses of capitalism. Now, they have plenty of connections to the Conservative Party. Plenty of Conservative ministers and government members and MPs have spent time talking at places like the Institute of Economic Affairs and the Centre for Policy Studies. The Centre for Policy Studies itself was set up by Margaret Thatcher in the 1970s to try and counteract the Keynesian consensus that we had at the time. And there are many links in terms of how papers that have been written by people from the Institute of Economic Affairs, for example, have been used to set policy when in government. In fact, the whole disastrous Liz Truss mini-budget was essentially kind of cooked up in the halls of the IEA, and that's what crashed the economy, hence why the Tuftonocracy, as it's been called, kind of got kicked out of the way. Once the Liz Truss moment happened, everybody knew that they were there, and everybody knew how awful they were. There's a really great video by Tom Nicholas about think tanks and how they're essentially just fronts for propaganda that I highly recommend people going and watching as well once you finish this video. One thing though about the liberal types, as you see from this tweet very specifically, is that their view of the Tuftonocracy and about Tufton Street and the think tanks is that they are solely being represented by the Conservative Party in government. Now, this isn't true. They are making all of these grand proclamations like this person here, not to single out this person, but it was just representation of the kind of viewpoint that you got, which is that somehow, now the Conservatives are no longer in government, the think tanks, both Tufton Street and not, will no longer have access to the government and have access to policy. I would like to mention these people are also vegetable IQ and should not be allowed to use metal cutlery. So let's cast our eyes back to Saturday, when Wes Streeting, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, announced that, with no evidence being provided for this, because he mentioned the Cass review, which didn't call for a ban on puberty blockers, he has created a ban on puberty blockers, which is a continuation of a temporary ban by Victoria Atkins, the previous Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, which is done entirely with a political motivation, because they want fewer trans people. That's literally it. They just want fewer trans people, and they want trans people's lives to be worse. Not even Hilary Cass, the person who was, as been admitted by Kemi Badenoch now, was a political appointee to create the agitprop that they needed to attack transgender healthcare. Not even she found evidence for a blanket ban on puberty blockers. She recommended there being more research into them, and that's fine. Adrian Kelly went to Novara Media the other day to discuss it on Monday, and I highly recommend watching that too, which gave a really good outline as to why this policy is entirely flawed and being done for political reasons, and not indeed for utilitarian reasons. Now, one would think, why does Wes Streeting doing this? Well, first of all, he's a fundamentalist Christian, as we've seen from his connections to evangelical groups. But on top of that, the guy has been openly transphobic by denying that trans women have been in interviews with The Sun, for example, and with Talk TV and Julia Hartley-Brewer. But the key part of this guy has loads of links to Policy Exchange, a right-wing, a far-right think tank. And it's not just something that he's done recently either. This is Wes Streeting talking to Policy Exchange years ago about his plans for additional NHS privatisation, where he decried the left wing of the Labour Party as being the true conservatives who refuse to see change in the health service. And by that he means an increased role for the private sector. It's why he's appointed people like Alan Milburn and people who with other interests in private sector, NHS capacity. And also he's been donated to by people who have investments in the private healthcare sector. There's no wonder why this man is also there parroting a right-wing line on trans healthcare, and has also been parroting right-wing lines on increased private sector roles in NHS provision. Because this man is in the pocket of think tanks, and in the pocket of private healthcare, and in the pocket of the transphobes. As Joe Moore says here, If you want to understand how we got here, it might be worth looking at his links with Policy Exchange, whose position on trans people is so extreme, sometimes even Murdoch's papers won't publish it. To put that to the case in point with this is an excellent YouTuber, highly recommend people go and watch. Like, they just read a publication on transgenderism on the Policy Exchange website, bragging about how they're trying to turn public opinion against people being allowed to transition entirely, together with brave people like J.K. Rowling. This is ideological corruption of healthcare from Wes Streeting, deliberately doing the bidding of the think tanks that the Liberals think now have no access to the government now that Conservatives have been kicked out and the Labour Party have been put into government instead. Just shows you how naive these people are, that they think the Labour right don't eat out of the same troughs as all of the Conservative Party do as well. And this is very much in line. This is very much in line with the statements that were made by people like Helen Joyce, saying that the number of people being allowed to transition should be reduced as much as possible. That is the end goal of the gender criticals, as few trans people as possible. Remember the person at CPAC? Remember Michael Knowles at CPAC saying transgenderism should be eradicated from society? This is the kind of through line of thought that underpins a lot of what's happening behind the scenes on this, and the think tanks help drive this. Turning public opinion against people being allowed to transition at all is their end goal. And this is the kind of people who Wes Streeting has the ear of in government. And this isn't just the only person who has had links to Policy Exchange. This paper by Policy Exchange, called Asleep at the Wheel, was essentially what Suella Braverman used as her blueprint for changing schools' guidance to out trans children to their abusive parents. The foreword to this was written by Rosie Duffield MP. Trevor Phillips has loads of links to the Labour Party, and he's a fellow at Policy Exchange, in which he has contributed to what some people have described as Islamophobic material in there as well. So people all over the Labour Party have loads of links to this incredibly far-right think tank. And if you really, after all of this, you think maybe it's a couple of bad eggs, maybe it's only a couple of Labour MPs, and I'm sure that they're doing it entirely with the public interest in mind, and it's not indeed people being incredibly backhanded in terms of the way in which they do governance. To top all of this off, the Labour Party have approached the founder of Policy Exchange, Nick Bowles, to help their new planning reforms. And this is coming directly from the Starmer Politburo. Not just single ministers, not just random members of the party or on the backbenches like Rosie Duffield, or with hangers-on like Trevor Phillips. No, so people at the top of the Starmer government are approaching the people who set up these think tanks in the first place to help them set policy. Again, I keep saying this. This is just a changing of the guard. This isn't some drastic revolution in the way that we do politics. It's politics by think tank, just like it was throughout the Conservative Party period. So people out here thinking, oh, think how sad Tufton Street are going to be. They may not be as happy because the level of access that they have is far less than they were before. But the idea that they will now not have access at all is complete nonsense. And it just shows you like the absolute child's view of politics these people have, where it's just red team good, blue team bad, the evil people like the blue team. No, the Labour right are eating out of the same trough, and they always have done. And they always have done. They do not have your or my interests at heart. When they say government return to service, think who they're actually serving. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.